Well, hello there, YouTube universe. We are going to show you how to get up and running quickly with Spring Boot using Spring Boot for a Spring MVC web application that can be deployed to an embedded version of Tomcat. And we're going to do that just by using our IntelliJ editor here, which is my IDE of choice. And we're going to just very quickly create a Maven project using the Java 8 SDK to get started. And we'll call this com.techzonk, and we'll call the artifact just zonk boot, just to give it a really easy memorable name. I'll call it zonk boot here as well, and we'll get started. That's going to just create our project for us. Hopefully that's what we've got, and it is indeed. We have got us a loading project, so we'll let that do its thing kind of in the background. And as that's getting set up, we'll just jump back over to the documentation for Spring Boot. So Spring Boot is this really kind of interesting way to get up and running with a Spring application a lot quickly than what you might be used to if you've been using Spring for a number of years. And it's telling us that all we need is about 15 minutes. Of course, our favorite IDE, the JDK 1.8 version or later. We're using 1.8. And our build tool of choice, which in this case is going to be Maven. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and get started with the Maven instructions here. And to kind of keep it easy on myself, I'm going to take their example for a POM. This is a pom.xml. That's the project object model. And I'm going to copy that over to the clipboard. And then I'll jump back over to my IDE, and I'll see what we've got here. And then rather than just totally replacing what I've got, I'm just going to go ahead and paste this underneath what I've got and just sort of pick and choose what I want to include in my project. So I'll grab the Spring Framework, well, not this, actually the parent node is what I want. So we'll identify the parent node here as being something that we want to cut and paste, and I'll grab this dependency. There's only one dependency in this example, and that's the Spring Boot Starter Web artifact that you get from the org.springframework.boot group. I'll grab that and I'll cut and paste that from there, and I'll go back up to my project and I'll just paste that in here. And then I think that I also want to grab this build node as well. So I'm pretty much grabbing everything, frankly. In fact, what I'll do is I'll include this property that specifies the Java version as well. So I'll grab that and I'll cut and paste that here in my project model as well. Get rid of some of this extra white space. And basically what I've done is I've taken pretty much everything they've given us in their example and included it in my project. And I kind of went a roundabout way of doing it. And that was really just to kind of keep it a little bit easier on myself by using what the IDE gave me as far as the group ID and the artifact ID tags, and the version which I kind of kept as default, which is 1.0 snapshot. My IDE is asking me to enable auto import or import changes. So I'm going to enable auto import, and then what Maven is going to do in the background is it's going to take a look at my POM here. It's going to recognize that I'm specifying some dependencies. It's going to download those in the background. In fact, my computer is doing a fair amount of work. You may hear some background noise of the fan kind of cooling things off. I'm on a MacBook Pro, and that thing can kind of get hot sometimes when I'm working on Java, and I've got a handful of Java processes running in the background. So that's what's going on right now. So that gets us started as far as creating the Mavenized project. Now what I'm going to do is follow their documentation here and start creating my simple web application. And just to warn you, things may go wrong here in this tutorial. The idea is that you can get up and running quick with Spring Boot. I've never actually done it myself. I've read through the documentation. It looks really simple. So what we'll do is we'll follow along with this documentation, and you'll just have to forgive me if I stumble over some things here, because I really haven't actually done this before. So let's jump back over to our IDE, because in this particular case it's telling us to go ahead and create the simple web application by creating a controller. And if you look at the example here, they're creating a REST controller, which is great. Let's go ahead and do the same exact thing. I will come over here though, and I will specify something a little bit different. I'm going to go into source main Java, and I'm going to create a new package. Let's do that. I'm going to create the package, and I'm going to call this package com.techzonk, and then what do we call this? We called it zonk boot. I'm going to say OK to that. That creates my package. I'm going to first create a Java class that we'll call application. And I won't do anything with it yet. I'll just create that class. And then I will create an additional package, and I will call that com.techZonk.ZonkBoot.controller. And that's actually where I want to put my controller. So I'll create another class, and I'll call that Zonk controller. And we'll say OK. So now that I've got my controller class, we're going to go back to our documentation. We're going to reference what they're telling us to do here. And if you look, it's really simple. We're going to identify our class as being a REST controller using the annotation they've specified here. And then we're going to create a simple endpoint mapping using the request mapping endpoint that they've got right here. So let's jump back over to the IDE. And first things first, we'll say, yes, indeed, this is a REST controller. So we'll identify it as such. And we'll go over here and we'll start implementing our endpoint. We'll call this, just like the documentation does, we'll call it public string index. And what we'll do is we'll simply return hello world. Because what else can you possibly return in an example application? So just like the documentation tells us, we're going to identify this as being a request mapping. And then we'll say that our endpoint is going to be /hello. And that's that. So that we'll save. Then we'll go back to the application class that we created here in the root package of com.techZonk.ZonkBoot. And I'll get rid of my comments here. And then we'll jump back over to the documentation and we'll see exactly what it is that we need to do, because I know it's a little bit different with Spring Boot. So it's telling us that we're going to create the application class. We're going to make sure that we include some specific components here. And all it's telling us, which is kind of interesting, is that we just need a single annotation of Spring Boot application. So before I get into exactly how the implementation looks, let's see if we can understand why it is that it's so simplified. So it's saying we're including the single annotation, and this annotation is going to cover all of the following. If you've ever done a Spring MVC application before, then these are going to look very familiar to you. You've got your @configuration annotation. This is going to tell you, where the source of the bean definitions are. In a lot of cases, that's going to be in the application class itself. Enable auto configuration is going to tell Spring Boot to start adding beans based on class path settings, etc. This is the kind of thing that you would normally see if you're using annotations as opposed to XML when you're setting up a Spring-based application, specifically Spring MVC. For this one here, enable web MVC. So that's definitely what we're doing. We are doing a Spring MVC app, but according to our documentation here, we don't need to specify this particular annotation. And then lastly, component scan. This I'm sure is familiar to you if you've used Spring before. It's going to tell Spring to look for other components, other configuration items, and other services, based on annotations and where they exist in specific packages. It's telling us that we don't need to include this annotation either, that just identifying the single Spring Boot application annotation in our app is all it takes. So we're going to do that on our application class just like they've done in the documentation here. So before I go into my implementation of the main method, let's just go ahead and say Spring Boot application, and that's it. That's all we have to do to identify all of those specific dependencies of our application. Then we can implement our public static void main method. And it's just like any other static void main method in a Java application. If you've done one before, you're going to identify a string array for your arguments. And then the implementation is pretty simple. They do a little bit more than I'm expecting to do here. But all I really want to do is I want to invoke the run method, which is a static method, on the class Spring application. And I'm going to pass it two arguments. I'm going to pass it the application class, and then any arguments that I get when the application is started. I don't necessarily feel as though for this particular tutorial that I need to include this this output in the console, or take a look at all of the beans that are being loaded. But you can certainly do that. You can follow along in the documentation and do that if you'd like. I'm not going to have a lot of beans in this particular tutorial, so it won't be a very compelling demonstration anyway. So I'm just going to invoke the run method like so. So Spring application dot run, and it's going to take let's import it. It's going to take 2 arguments, the name of this class, and then it's going to take my arguments collection, and that's it. That should be all I need to get this application started, and that's based on the documentation here. So it's saying at this point that you can run the application, so I'm going to give it a shot. I'm not 100% sure if there's anything else that I need to do here. I've gone through this already, and it looks like it's pretty straightforward for what I'm doing, which is just booting up an application that's web ready and responds to REST endpoints. I think that I've got everything I need. I'll take one last look. I've got the controller here. It's identified as a REST controller. It has a single request mapping of /hello. I've got my Spring Boot application defined. I've annotated it as such. I'm running with the application class and the args. There's only one more thing that I want to do. I want to make this a little bit different, and I want to create an application properties file. So I'll do that. And in this, I want to specify a unique port. The server port we're going to identify as being 9191. So by default, it's because it's embedded Tomcat, it's going to load up. It's going to try to put this on port 8080. In my case, I want it to be on 9191, just because I don't know if I have anything running on 8080 right now, and I want to avoid any conflicts. You don't necessarily have to do that, but if you wanted to specify that you want your application to run on port 80, which is the standard web browsing application, creating the application properties file here in source main resources is the way to do it. And then Spring just knows to look for that file and account for these specific property names and behave accordingly at startup. So I think that I've got everything that I need. I've got my controller. I've got my application that identifies this as a Spring Boot application. I think I'm good. So I'm running in IntelliJ. What I'm going to do is I'm going to edit my configurations. I'm going to create a new configuration as just an application. I'm going to call this zonk boot run, and I'm going to identify the main class application that we created, and I believe that that should be all that I need to get this running. Let me say OK to that. So let's see, I've got my run configuration up here and ready for me. I've got my controller, I've got my application. I'm feeling like I've got everything that I need. I'm a little uncertain, but I'm going to go ahead and start the application, and we'll see what we get. The console is going to pop up down here when it gets started, so we'll see what we've got going here. It's building it right now. When it's done building it, which is just in a second, we'll see. Okay, good. So we see the Spring Boot logo coming up here in our console. I do see that it's let's see, it's identified the Tomcat service. It does say that that's starting. I do see some mappings getting created here in the console. I don't know that I actually saw the hello mapping. Oh, look, here it is. I see the hello mapping. That's kind of a good sign. So I think we're probably in good shape. I created that application properties file that starts Tomcat on port 9191, and it's telling me here that that's what I've got. So the application started. It took about 6 seconds. We should be good to go. Let me jump back over to the browser and see. Go over here. This is going to be running at localhost. We'll call it 9191, and we'll say /hello. And it says hello world. That's terrific. It's exactly what I was hoping for. So creating a Spring MVC application, it can be somewhat of a daunting task. But if you come over here and look at the documentation here for Spring Boot, you'll see there was not much that I had to do to get that going. It was made a lot easier for me because I'm using Maven to manage my dependencies. I didn't have to download anything to get Spring Boot running. Maven kind of does that for me in the background. But you saw, if you've ever put up a Spring MVC application before, you're wrestling with the web.xml, you've got your deployment descriptor. If you've got XML-based configurations, you're wiring all your beans together. There could be a lot to do to kind of get up and running with a Spring MVC application, but Spring Boot definitely makes it a lot easier. And I think that this is something that I'm going to use going forward with some of the tutorials that I've got planned down the road that I know are going to be dependent on REST endpoints. So thanks for watching this video. I found Spring Boot to be incredible, and just in the few minutes that I've messed with it. Hopefully you did too. If you did, please like the video. If there's something about this video that you don't care for, let me know in the comments. And of course, if you'd like to see more, please subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.